I'd just like to thank Greening Australia and the De Grey LCDC for getting this function together, and it's been so well organised and the information is incredibly good, so I've certainly appreciated it. Okay, and as Tim mentioned, he's been involved with the carbon work for some years with me, and also Ostian, sitting over there, and I thank them and all the others that were involved as well. Okay, so I'll just be trying to give you you can go to the next slide, give you an overview of the carbon world in WA for the rangelands, and I'll be doing that using 3 topics. So I'll go through what's called our Carbon Awareness Project, all the work that we did under that, I'll explain. I'll have a few words about organic carbon, just a few words because it's been pretty well covered already by Peter Andrews and Chris and others that have been speaking before me. And then I'll try to give you an optimistic view of the future in regards to carbon, but that's not going to be so easy. Okay, thanks, Pip. So I'll just start off with this theme. Given that this is 2015 is the International Year of Soil, I thought I'd have this as a theme that threads its way through this talk. So organic carbon is good for soil, and all the home gardeners amongst you would know that the truth of that. But the principles apply everywhere, including the rangelands. Thanks, Pip. Okay, so there has been carbon studies done in WA for quite some time. The first studies were done in the late 70s, 1970s, early 80s. Down here at Sturt Meadows, a Japanese research consortium, including some bods from CSIRO, did some work out there which included carbon. The project wasn't primarily carbon focused, but it included some useful information. Most of the work has since been done in the last 5 years, 6 years, initially by the Department of Agriculture and Food, and more recently by Rangelands NRM. So you can see these red dots indicate the study areas. So we have reasonable coverage, geographic coverage of carbon data, but the map is actually a bit misleading because these dots are actually tiny in reality. So we're still very short of data on carbon in the rangelands. So there's a lot more work to be done in the future. Okay, thanks, Pip. Okay, I'll talk about the Carbon Awareness Project now. It's funded by Royalties for Regions, and it was a 3.5 4-year project. It finishes next year, June next year. So we're just in the wind-up phase, and unfortunately there's no further funding for the carbon work to follow on from what we've been doing, which utterly disappoints me. The work we've been doing is in partnership with Department of Ag in certain areas, not every area that we've worked in, but more importantly, we've been working with the very interested pastoralists and other land managers who've been engaging with us and trying to help us understand what's happening in the carbon world on their properties. Thanks, Pip. So the Carbon Awareness Project has 2 main objectives. The first one being simply to raise awareness or knowledge about carbon in the environment and the carbon farming opportunities and the barriers. A lot of that work was, there were 2 main parts of the work. The first part being to repackage information that came out of the Australian government, initially under the Carbon Farming Initiative, the CFI, and present that in a way that's suitable for people to understand in the rangelands, to make it it's tailored so to make it applicable. The CFI then became the ERF, the Emissions Reduction Fund, under the direct action policy of the Liberals, and we've had to keep up to date with the changes with the legislation and the policies and all the methods or methodologies that it used to be called, it's now methods, under those schemes. So we've been repackaging that and presenting that. And we've been presenting it at workshops and demonstration days. So as part of the second part, we've been holding demonstration days in the field, in the midst of our field work, and we invite pastoralists from near and far to come along and watch us doing the sampling so they can learn how we actually go about sampling for carbon. And then we've been doing the science side of it. The science part of it is actually very, very important because it underpins, if anyone wants to get into the carbon game, they need to understand the science and how things are done. Without that science, you just simply cannot do it. No one can do it. So we've been trying to fill that gap, and there's still a lot more to do. Okay, no, go back, please, Pip. So the science is really about understanding the distribution of carbon in the environment, and we've been doing that on a land system basis. So for those who are not so familiar with that term, a land system is part of a hierarchical sequence of land subdivisions, and a land system has a recognisable pattern or association of soil types, vegetation types and topography. So we can recognise those associations in different parts of the landscape. So the work we're doing is land system based. And there's a couple of aspects to characterising a land system in terms of its carbon, and that is its carbon density or concentration. In other words, how much carbon is in an area on a unit basis. Each land system has its own characteristics in terms of where that carbon is distributed, how much is distributed above the ground in the biomass, and how much is distributed in the soils, the below ground. And this factor here, the variability, being the rangelands, it's a highly variable environment. Same with carbon, it is highly variable. And that's been our biggest bugbear because it means you have to do a lot of sampling to capture that variability. An important point is that in the areas we have been sampling for carbon, we have sampled in areas where there's been a degradation and non-degraded areas, but in those degraded areas, there are always areas where there's a plan for rehabilitation. So there's opportunities there to compare degraded areas with the rehabilitated areas in the future. So we've done, if you like, the benchmark studies for those degraded areas, and we can then compare them in the future or with the current non-degraded areas or less degraded areas. So that's a little picture there just showing where the carbon might be stored. So we're talking about sequestered carbon in the above ground biomass, in the trunks of the trees, the branches and leaves, the grasses growing on the top, of course. And then the below ground is all the root material of the plant itself, plus the organic matter in the soil itself. So that includes all the very fine roots, the microbes, just everything that has carbon, organic carbon in it. Thanks, Pip. So in our studies, there's three main phases of the work that is undertaken. Starting down here in the bottom left is the field work. All of our work has been field work. We've not yet used remote sensing, so it's all been field-based. And we've been taking literally hundreds of thousands of measurements and thousands and thousands of samples. So there has been some destructive sampling, but that's unavoidable. of the vegetation, and for the below ground carbon we've been taking soil cores. And the standard depth to sample for carbon is 30 centimetres or 300 mils. So we just use a small drilling rig. Question? Okay, so the sampling there has been done now on a number of different areas, and we've got data now for approximately 25 land systems throughout Western Australia. That's pretty small bickies really, considering there's over 500 land systems in the rangelands. So. Okay, the next phase of the work is to send the samples to laboratory for analysis, and we analyse for a number of what are called analytes, or things to analyse for. So the vegetation samples are analysed for carbon, or it's organic carbon, nitrogen and moisture. And all the biomass is dried to constant weight before the analysis is undertaken, but we need to know the moisture content. The soil samples are analysed for total carbon, that's both non-organic carbon and organic carbon, because a lot of the material has carbonates in it, which can skew the carbon content if you're not aware of the non-organic carbon content. So we need to know the total, the organic carbon, nitrogen, and a thing called bulk density, which is basically how dense the soil is. So you can have a light soil which has a low bulk density, or a very compacted, usually clay-rich soil, which has a high bulk density. And that influences the calculation of the containing carbon. The final step is the statistical analysis of all that data, and from the lab we get hundreds of pages of results with about 400 results on each page. So we've got reams and reams of numbers that we have to handle and analyse, and it's quite a big job. But what the statistical analysis does is basically allow us to calculate how much carbon is above the ground in the vegetation, in the biomass, and how much is in the soil underneath. And then we can combine the two to get a total organic carbon content. And all the other variables, standard areas, and range and all that sort of stuff. This CN ratio, carbon-nitrogen ratio, that's also an important factor. That's the ratio between the amount of carbon and the amount of nitrogen that's in the system. And that's an indicator of how quickly the carbon will be recycled, basically. It's an important ratio for modelling. I'll get onto that a bit later. Okay, thanks Pip. Here's some photos of the work. The top left, there's Ostean on the right, and she is sampling the ground litter, or the leaf litter, twigs and so forth, that are occurring on the surface. So in terms of the above ground biomass, we are sampling everything from the leaf and ground litter right on the soil surface, through the dead material still attached to the trees and the shrubs, to the live material of the trees and plants themselves. So it's essentially everything. It's all scraped up, bagged and sent to the lab. We subsample it. So we cut down the whole mulga tree, weigh everything, and then subsample it to send smaller samples to the lab. We did try sending a whole mulga tree on a semi-trailer to the lab, but they rejected it. I don't know why. That's right. Bottom left there, you can see some of the above ground biomass, the shrub material, tree material. It's being weighed. This is a fresh weight. So when this stuff eventually gets to the lab, they'll dry it and produce a dry weight, so we can calculate how much moisture is involved, is contained in there. Top right, that's in the lab, preparing the samples. That's a biomass sample in the bag there that's being dragged out, and there are thousands of bags of that material. Many of those bags had Acacia victoriae in them, so when the labbies put their hands in, they got a surprise. And down on the bottom right is a small drilling rig that we used to sample the soil. It produced cores of soil, which were sent whole to the lab for the analysis there. Okay, let's go on. Okay, here's some data. It's not a data-rich talk, but here's a little bit of data that gives examples of land system characterisation. So the top one here is for quite a productive land system here in the Pilbara, and it's a tussock grassland on an nice alluvial plain, and the above ground carbon, the mean value is around 3 tonnes per hectare. Its range is from 2 to 18. You see, Tim? And the below ground carbon, tonnes per hectare again, is about 11, mean of 11, and it ranges from 6 to 19. This proportion is the proportion of above ground carbon stocks compared to the below ground carbon stocks. So you can see there that in this particular land system, this nice tussock grass here, about 21% of the total carbon is contained in the grasses. Okay? And that proportion is a characteristic of all the land systems. Every land system is different. So. Yes. So that proportion is the above ground carbon compared to the total carbon. So 21% of the carbon is contained above ground and 79% below ground. Make sense?
How did you go about getting every last root and mulga you dug up?
We didn't. In the cores, we take enough cores to actually get a representative sample of the root systems. So when you're drilling down, you're actually penetrating the root systems. But I also included a factor in the calculation. From previous studies, not our own work, there's a relationship between the mass of the above ground part of the plant to the below ground part of the plant.
We all knew it in kindergarten.
That's right.
Knew that 3 times what we saw above ground was 3 times under.
Yeah, it's no secret. That's right. But to factor that in, you need to know what the factor is, and studies have been done, and we include it. So these are very good numbers. They're very encouraging, and I'll explain why a bit later on. So looking at the second land system, this is in the southern rangelands in the Murchison region, and the above ground carbon, mean value of 26 tonnes of carbon per hectare, compared to below ground carbon of 5 tonnes per hectare. So you can see the proportion has flipped. The proportion of above ground is now 84% of the total carbon. So different land system. So the rule of thumb basically in conceptualising this is that if you have woody vegetation here in the WA rangelands, if you have woody vegetation such as the broadleaf mulga here, it's usually growing on carbon poor soils such as a hard pan, and so there'll be more carbon contained in that above ground vegetation than there is in the soil below. So how is this data used? So for those considering a carbon farming project, they will need to know, in ballpark figures at least, how much carbon they're likely to be starting with before they actually do the management change as part of the carbon farming process, in order to do a feasibility study as to whether it's financially viable to undertake such a project. Without the ballpark figure, then you've got nowhere to start from. So what we've done is select land systems that are hopefully representative of regions. So if you have an analogous or a similar land system, you can then compare it to the data that we have and say, okay, it's likely that this land system that I'm considering doing a carbon farming project on is going to have X amount of carbon in it distributed this way, because I'm just comparing it to a similar land system that has been studied. Because the situation is that we just don't have the funds or the time even to study all the land systems to get that benchmark or starting point data. So I'm calling it benchmark, not baseline. Baseline is a term that's we tend to use in relation to the actual start of a carbon farming project. So the baseline is the start point, the actual start point, and then you go on in time measuring the amount of carbon that's sequestered over time. So the start point is the baseline. I'm calling it benchmark just to give you another term as a starting point for considering a carbon farming project, but it's not actually a formal project start point. Okay, so the data, the work we've been doing is all field data, but hopefully in the future we'll be feeding into remote sensing, decision tools and computer modelling, and I'll give you some examples of these, eventually to assist people to undertake a carbon farming project or an offset project. As I mentioned, all the work we've been doing is field work. I had hoped to have a follow-on project with funding to advance particularly this aspect here, because the field work is so expensive and time consuming that no sequestration project could ever be viable. So we need to get the remote sensing sorted so that we can use that to make projects viable, carbon farming project viable, reduce the cost. Righto, thanks Pip. So this is an example of some modelling that CSIRO did not so long ago. I think it's about 2 years ago they produced this. No, 18 months ago, more recently. It's a lovely product and it models the amount of carbon in soil across Australia. The red colours are low values of carbon and the blue colours are relatively high amounts of carbon. So you can see in the southwest of WA, the blues, and around the coastal and snowy mountains regions and the Great Dividing Range areas where the blue is, so there's relatively high amounts of carbon in those areas. And then in the rangelands, most of that is variations on the red theme, much lower amounts of carbon. It's a lovely product, as I said, but it's wrong. For Eastern Australia, it's not too bad, but for Western Australia, it is wrong because it's not been calibrated. So they've done their best effort, and it's a good effort to produce this product, but hasn't been properly calibrated simply because of the lack of data. We've yet to contribute our data to CSIRO. Okay, next one. This is a great product. This is again estimating carbon, the amount of carbon in the above ground vegetation for Eastern Australia, done by the Queensland Government, and it has been calibrated, so it's a nice product. So the darker colours indicate the higher amounts of carbon and the paler fawn colours indicate low amounts of carbon. This is a product that Richard Glover and myself did 3 years ago for Yarrie Station. We did a GIS-based analysis of what we expected the carbon to be in the above ground biomass in the vegetation. You can see some variations in there, but like the first product, this is uncalibrated, so we didn't have any field data to actually calibrate it with when we did this desktop study. But it was useful exercise in telling us what we need to know from the field work to improve this sort of product. So what I mean is, with remote sensing, the sensors will detect whatever is being detected. It might be infrared, whatever is being censored to estimate something, but you need some points along the way in order to calibrate that sensor to get the correct values. Does that make sense?
So more detail there, so you can specifically go where it is that there is a break or quantifiable amount of carbon in
Yeah.
that particular spot.
Yeah. So, yeah. So on a pixel by pixel basis, if you've got some pixels that have been calibrated with direct measurement, you can calibrate the sensors basically, or the interpretation of the sensors data.
So that data there is satellite information using calibrated priorities.
This one here, this is not satellite, this is a GIS-based modelling using soil data, climatic data, vegetation data, as in vegetation types. It's mulga country. Yeah.
So that's sort of just an average of that.
Well, it is pixelled. Each pixel, from memory, was about 30 metres square, 30 by 30, and we modelled each pixel based on the layers of information that we'd input to estimate how much carbon should be there. It's not right, it's not correct, but it was useful in helping us understand what is required from the field data to actually do a better job of estimating how much carbon is across the landscape. Okay, soil organic carbon. So what is it? So I've been talking about carbon, and to answer Jack's question, it's a substance that ranges in complexity from very simple, for example, this is a methane, a single carbon surrounded by 4 hydrogen atoms. That's a very simple compound, methane, right through to complex, very complex structures of many different carbon atoms with other oxygens and hydrogens attached. But the key thing is they're all plant, animal or organism derived. So carbon dioxide may or may not be an organic compound, depending on how it's produced. It can be produced synthetically in the lab, so it's not strictly an organic compound. And when we're measuring carbon in the environment, we're looking at all the living material as well as the dead material, and if it's dead, all the stages of decomposition from virtually just died right through to completely decomposed into component compounds. So that when you get the results back from the lab, it's actually measuring all this stuff. So what benefits does organic carbon provide? So it's an energy source for the organisms that live in the soil. If there's not enough carbon, then the soil is not going to support a good community of organisms. The soil will be less healthy, less functional. Carbon is an essential nutrient for plants. Carbon forms the main components of cellulose and lignin, the main conductive tissue in plants, and the structural tissue that support the plant is made of carbon-based compounds. But for us, very importantly, carbon provides the soil with stability, allows the soil to be stable, reducing the erodibility of the soil, makes it just much better soil, much more robust, able to support healthy plants, reduce or resist erosion better, and forms a better structure as well. And that enables the soil to contain or to hold more water. So there's much more drought resistance with a healthy soil compared to a soil that's in poor condition, which has very little drought resilience or resistance. So in the media you may have heard of the term we need to decarbonise our economy. Well, I want to introduce you to a new term called recarbonise. So in anything you do, if you can recarbonise the soil will be better off. In most circumstances, you'll be better off because there'll be better primary productivity. So how do you do that? You simply increase the amount of vegetation growing on the land. So with more vegetation growing, there's more leaf fall drop, more bark, whatever, going to the ground surface and then gradually being incorporated into the soil as organic matter, as organic carbon. Okay, this is an example of the relationship between poor soil and healthy soil. So here we have a graph with a plot of weaner percentages along the x-axis. Weaner percentages increasing to the right there from 30 to 60%. And the y-axis, we've got the annual forage required by a 150 kilo weaner, its requirements. So you can see that as the weaning rates decline, the amount of forage that the animals need to eat increases. Now, importantly, the underlying relationship is that why the animals are needing to increase the amount of forage that they eat is because the forage quality, the nutrient quality of the forage is declining. So the animals, in trying to meet their nutrient needs, are trying to eat more material. And that's because it's a degrading or degraded environment. It's lost the palatable shrubs, which are usually nutrient rich. It's lost the biodiversity, the diversity of shrubs and grasses that animals would normally be eating to get their nutrient requirements. So in a degraded environment, poor old animals are really struggling to meet their nutrient requirements. And yes, as you can see, with a 30% weaning rate, most of them don't make it, simply because they can't get the nutrients. And it's because the soils are also depauperate or short of carbon to support the plants. So it's all connected. The plants growing on the surface, the soil needs to be healthy. So that's a good example where poor soils, poor vegetation has a direct effect on the bottom line of your enterprise. Okay, next one, Pip. Let's try to race through. There's two types of carbon abatement, and I've been speaking mainly about sequestration carbon, but the other type is emissions avoidance. Next one. With emissions avoidance projects in WA, because there are no carbon rights involved in this type of emissions carbon abatement project, it is viable. So as we've seen with the savanna burning in the north, these are viable projects. Okay, sequestration projects. This is the dismal part of the story, because sequestration projects rely on the project proponent having rights to the carbon. And at the moment in Western Australia, the rights reside with the Minister for Lands, and so far the government has shown no inclination to devolve those rights to the lessee. That's right.
So is there a framework in place in Western Australia for people to do carbon trading?
If you did emissions avoidance projects, yes. And the framework is directly with the Australian government through the ERF, the Emissions Reduction Fund, and the Clean Energy Regulator. So yes, there is a process that you can go through.
And is there any package available to
Well, I'm sorry, it's great stuff, but we really need to move on. Good questions further, Lee Smoker.
This is a long one. So, will I call it quits here? Quickly. Okay. So, carbon rights I've mentioned. There's no legal precedent for carbon rights to be devolved to lessees in the rangelands on leasehold country. And there are also untested implications for triggering native title. The science is still incomplete. We do not yet have cost-effective methods for measuring sequestered carbon. That's where the remote sensing needs to come in to reduce those costs. Land system surveys, we've just scratched the surface at the moment with information on 25 land systems compared to the over 500 that exist. And we still don't have much information on how fast carbon is sequestered, the rates of sequestration both in the biomass itself and in the soils. It's not a difficult thing to do, but it hasn't been done yet. And there's a lack of carbon project case studies to use as examples if you're considering a project. So there's, in terms of actual practical guidelines or real case studies, they don't exist yet. And there's still some income diversity difficulties. You can apply for an enterprise diversification permit on a leasehold land, but it's a bit of an onerous process. All I can suggest is that there are winds of positive change in the air, so please remain positive, proactive, as in gathering information, and show some patience. You can start thinking about possible projects, get the information, and at the end of my talk I've got a list of links, website links that you can go to. It's a good idea to start thinking, if you're doing an ESRM planning, to think about how you might incorporate carbon into that plan and perhaps do a small trial. And here's a very important point though. If you are considering a carbon project, register your interest with the Clean Energy Regulator as soon as you have that idea and are seriously considering doing a project. If you don't, you will fail the newness test. So what the newness test means is that the work that you're doing to sequester or reduce carbon emissions must be new to you, basically, as a new way of managing the land. So register your intent to do so. It doesn't obligate you to do anything. You can just forget it if you don't like it after all. It doesn't obligate, there's no financial penalty, whatever. But it saves you failing the newness test. Okay.
Sorry, yeah, further.
How long they get you would get something back when you do that?
Sorry, how?
You enter your thing, you want your results back? Does it take long or
How many years before you get some results if you start up a carbon project?
results?
Oh, okay.
How long?
So with an emissions avoidance project, you are paid up front and then you have to actually do the work. So normally a contract with the government, the Australian government, will be for 5 or 7 years. It could be longer. But for a sequestration project, the payment periods are, I think it's 5 or 7, but the sequestration period is 25 years or 100 years. This is just a plea to be ecologically conscientious. So next click, thanks Pip. I'll let you read that. And the next one, thank you. And there's the links to the information should you need it. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.